morphology, based that domestic corn developed from a wild grass that grows today in this area known as teosinte, and the species name is Z. maiz. And these guys argued about this from the 1930s until the 90s, and they were still going. Certainly when I was in graduate school, even after I got out. So if you look at teosinte, these are stands of wild teosinte that are growing in western Mexico. You have very dense stands. There's lots of seeds there, but there are very distinctive differences between teosinte and maize. Okay, and the differences are is teosintes have, we'll see this in a second, have multiple spikes with single rows on each spike. And maize, of course, has a conglomerated single stalk with these ears, so multiple rows of ears. So Beadle argued that teosinte mutated. The spikes, these are the hard seed cases, evolved into a shallower, softer cupels. The glooms became elongated and covered the ears more completely, so you had the shucks that you have to pull off of them. And that teosinte, which has multiple stalks, shifted to where it had a single stalk. And that's what most people, that's what Mangelsdorff just choked on, was like, how can you have a plant that has multiple stalks evolve so quickly into a single stalk? And he just didn't see that. So Mangelsdorff argued that teosinte does not have ears, but spikes or rows of kernels. And the kernel's different too, and the changes and the stalks are just too dramatic to believe that what Beadle suggested was possible. Okay, so this is what teosinte looks like, and you have these basically these alternating seeds along each individual stalk of the plant. This is corn, where you have multiple ears growing off of here with a single stalk, and morphologically. Although they're both grasses, they almost couldn't be more different. And this argument went on and on and on forever. And it went on until in the 1990s or so, late 90s, people began to look at the genetics of here. And so one of the things that they did is they looked at the distribution of these plants, and one of the analyses that was done that showed that there were 3 perennial kinds of teosinte, 3 annual varieties of teosinte, and the 2 annual varieties are most similar to early corn. And these are Z. maiz mexicana and Z. maiz parviglumis. And then they did a guy by the name of Jean Doble did a studied the wild distribution of these. Z. maiz mexicana grows in central and northern Mexico in dry conditions. Parviglumis grows in southern and western Mexico in wet conditions. Okay, so you can see here, these areas, this is Z. maiz mexicana, they're up here and up here. The Parviglumis, there's some other areas here. The Parviglumis are here in Jalisco, and then down here in what are known as the central Balsas river valleys. This is where Tehuacan is. This is another early site of Gualanaquis here we'll talk about. And then eventually, Bruce Benz and Hugh Hodges did genetic studies of teosinte. Parviglumis has the exact same DNA that domestic maize has. They're virtually the same plant. They are virtually identical. Parviglumis DNA is different than the other varieties of teosinte. Okay, so the DNAs are remarkably similar, and the Tehuacan maize had these non-disarticulated kernels, so it must have been harvested and fertilized and planted. And today, there's very little doubt that Beadle was right, that maize evolved from teosinte, and somehow that they were able to achieve those transformations of multiple stalks with single rows of kernels to a single stalk with ears. But that happened. There's no doubt about that, and it spread and it took on. Interestingly, there's a variety that's grown in Argentina that is the most similar to Tehuacan remains found prehistorically, the earliest Tehuacan remains. And so what happened is you get these varieties. I don't know if I have a map up here or not. I don't think I do. Well, there's what the evolution of the kernels look like. But what happens is you get these varieties that start in these certain areas, and then they spread out, and the older varieties spread further. And so it's all the way down in Argentina, where that oldest variety, with some alteration, seems to have survived into modern day. And so that's probably the cob or the variety of corn that is most similar to this early corn that was produced in the Tehuacan Valley. But what you can see is through time is the ears, the cobs get longer, there's more rows, and you get more and more food. And so by the time you're growing something like this, you actually have, and I didn't realize that was down, sorry about that, you actually have corn that is incredibly productive, and there's a lot of plant food on that single ear, as we see today, the varieties we see today. It is little doubt, this is the variety that's grown in Argentina today. This is the reconstructed view of that on the stalk. So this is still somewhat evolved, but it's more primitive than any of the other ears and more than any of the other varieties. And so it's changed. It's changed the least here. So there's no question today that maize evolved early on from teosinte, and that somehow they were able to do this. The interesting thing is that the complication thing here is that maize is actually fairly complex genetically. Wheat, for instance, has a very simple genetic structure. Maize does not. So it takes a lot of experimentation and crossbreeding to get these changes. And one of the things that we can see is the spread of maize. It happens, the first maize gets domesticated quite early, and then it starts to spread out, and it's incredibly slow in spreading. And the reason is because it's so complex genetically that it takes a while. Now, we now have early dates from early maize from San Marcos Cave. It dates to about 2600 BC. It's slightly younger at Coxcatlan Cave. But the original conventional C14 dates, which were made on charcoal associated with maize, were almost twice as old, which was a big shock. So maize, the oldest evidence for maize we have, is not that old. It's about 5,000 years old or so. Piperno and Kent Flannery at the site of Gualanaquis, can't get that out right, excavating in Oaxaca, not far from Oaxaca City, have the oldest maize to date, dated to about 3,450 BC, or that would be about 5,500 BC or so, or BP, years ago. And so it probably goes back older. It's likely that the oldest maize was domesticated where Parviglumis grows today, further west. These are areas in Mexico which are no-go areas right now. So just as all this information was coming out was when all the drug gangs kind of started to explode, and there are areas there you just can't work in anymore, and you definitely can't walk around and look for sites and all that kind of stuff. You just wouldn't make it out. But people I know that work in those parts of Mexico drive in and drive out daily because they're so dangerous, and they work at well-known single sites, and they don't go around. It's a real, the fact that we can't do archaeology is not that big of a deal, to be honest with you. But what's happening in Mexico and all the craziness with all the drug gangs and stuff is destroying that country in a huge way. Anyway, and I don't want to get into the politics of it all, but it affects the archaeology. But again, that's not the main thing there. Okay, How much time do we have? Oh, I think I've got enough time to go through these. Okay, let's talk about beans. Phaseolus vulgaris are the general species of beans that are grown. There are lots of different varieties that are grown from northern Mexico into northern Argentina. There are wild forms that grow naturally, and they're still very common today. Beans look like this. They grow. There's seeds that are in pods, and when these things ripen, the pods start to open up and crack, and then split and do all sorts of things, and that disperses the seeds. Okay, so these are the wild forms. Domestic beans, the pod doesn't open up as easily. I won't say it never does, but I don't know if any of y'all have shucked peas or anything like that, but you have to put a little bit of effort in to get the beans or the peas out of the pod, and the reason is because the pod becomes tough. Just as you're collecting these, sorry, I went the wrong way. Just as you're collecting the wild ones, you're going to more than not collect the ones that are still in the pods, just happenstance. And again, this is a selection process that occurs just through the selection of collecting wild plants and then domesticating. The pods become tougher. Okay. What we know about the biochemistry of beans is beans contain a protein called phasolins. And there are different forms of phasolins. There are different forms of these proteins. They're given, they're characterized by different letters. So there's B, C, C, H, I, J, M, and S phasolins. Okay? Wild beans from Mexico and Central America contain phasolins M and S. Wild beans from the northern Andes contains phasolins of B, C, H, and I. And from the southern Andes, C, J, H, and T. So the wild species are distinctive by the kinds of these protein chemicals that are within them. So domestic beans from Mexico and Central America contain phasolins of type S. These are local beans that are being domesticated there. Domestic beans from South America contain phasolins C, H, and T, like the wild beans from the southern Andes. Beans were domesticated independently, both in South America and in Central America. There's no question about that. So you have independent domestication of beans in both places. Maize, however, was domesticated in Mexico only. It spread to South America quickly, but they were domesticated. Maize was domesticated in Mexico. Okay, so independent domestication. Let's see. Earliest beans are from Coxcatlan Cave, dated to about 300 BC, which is surprising. Many archaeologists think this is going to go further back, but we simply lack evidence. I'm going to stop there. One thing I'll add is we just published literally the finals were submitted the early part of this week, published a paper where we've got the first dated beans from the Southern Plains. We have lots of evidence for maize in the Southern Plains, but we've just now dated the first bean recovered from the Southern Plains in a period known as Antelope Creek. These were hunters and gatherers and farmers that lived up in the Panhandle near Amarillo, and none of their sites are terribly old. They're only a few hundred years old, and beans are quite late. For some reason, we don't have early evidence of beans, and I don't know why they didn't spread earlier, but they don't. And we're working on a bigger paper to look at the spread of domesticates across North America, and we have a huge database of over about 3,000 dates, and we're looking at the distribution of this, and we'll talk about that spread later on. So I'll finish up this lecture next time. We'll do the review, and then let's see if we can't. It won't take long to finish this. Let's see if we can't do the quiz. That would be next Wednesday instead of Monday. Okay. Okay. Any questions? Okie dokie.